It is 9:31. Suppose we can call it to order.
Let's go. Great.
Welcome to the policy committee meeting for April 26th. Welcome to our new chief legal counsel, Mr. Steve Libis.
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 Thank you.
Yeah. We're so glad to have you here. So our first agenda item is approving the March 22nd policy committee minutes.
Motion for approval.
Second. All those in favor? Wonderful.
We're recording, right?
Yes.
We are.
Just making
Yes.
sure.
Yes, I think.
Thank you.
Jeremy had said it started.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, you can speak up.
Okay, I'll speak up. The microphones aren't on. This is better. You can hear better.
Project.
Okay. I don't think the turn mic's on for these meetings.
Okay. Okay, I'll have the turns on.
Is this my phone?
I don't think
No, I
so.
don't think so.
All right.
They haven't been on in the past, so I have no such trouble without the mic, so.
Yeah. No one's ever accused me of being too quiet.
Correct. Yes.
All right, so we have 1.03 public comment as our next agenda item. We don't have mics, so I don't know.
We have to check in the podium. I'm not sure.
It's pushed up against the wall over there. I see it.
Well, I just see, I'm the only name on the list. Let's get you up. Let's get you a podium.
Let's make it formal.
Okay, let's see.
I guess they want to make sure that the recording will get everybody, even if the mic is
It does.
on.
It does.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
We're gonna get you close enough that in case there's an issue with the mic, it'll pick up your voice. Sounds great.
Okay,
Good morning.
Good morning.
good morning.
Hi, my name is Allison Rizzo. I'm speaking as an individual, not on behalf of any particular organization. I just wanted to share comments on two different items that are general to the work you're discussing today. The first is that we'll soon have over 1,300 public charter school students in our county, and more possibly if the board chooses to expand that to help with enrollment issues and expand choice options for families. So as you're thinking about this review of policies, I just wanted to invite you to keep in mind that those operators do have an opportunity to do things in a way that encourages innovation, and we wouldn't want to stifle their opportunity for innovation or in any way limit their autonomy that's any more than we would have to. So policies around safety, they're obvious that we want all students in the system to follow the same kind of safety requirements. But just I wanted to invite you to be mindful of that, because there have been some policies that have been, we've tried to apply to them as operators that are limiting and not in the spirit of what a public charter school is meant for. So if you have any questions, those operators are ready to respond. They know that you're going through this process and would be happy to provide some input if you ever decide that there might be a policy where you need to explore that further. The second is just on the discussion about public comment, and just I know all of you are eager to always hear from the public, and just wanted to encourage you to continue to make a sufficient time frame for public comment and do that in a way that allows participation from everyone. Last two times I've given public comment have been after the 10 o'clock hour or so. So I'm able to do that. It's a sacrifice for my family, and certainly all comments are worth hearing, and I know you all believe that. But I just wanted to suggest that perhaps you think creatively about timeframes that you could block out for that, to allow for that. I mean, a lot of those comments are singing praises of our staff and our students, and it gives people a good chance to feel like they're participating. And so if there are a number of people show up about an issue, it means that it matters to them and their families. And so we really want to make sure that we are helping them to participate rather than not discouraging them in any way. And also the last thought I had was, what policy ad would you make about how the Board of Ed would respond. So when you have a large number of people showing up for a comment like you did, or for a single issue, how would you expect the board to respond when great numbers come out about a particular matter? At least even if the board chooses to maintain its work and not make any change, but at least in a way to block out time to consider what that input is and why, and what kind of response is appropriate. So, thank you. We'll consider that.
Thank you. I'm using my phone
All right.
because we don't have the actual.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comment? We did have one emailed public comment in regards to our policy 441, transportation of students, that is attached to our board docs for the record. So I'm not going to read that into the record today. It's attached for anybody, and our committee members have already reviewed that. So we will move on to 1.04, review of current state of board education policy work.
So thank you for the warm welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to join Frederick County Public Schools in this role, and I'm really looking forward to working with everyone. As a team, and I've asked Dr. Sarah Sergo, the Chief of Staff, and Julie Nguyen, the Director of Human Resources, to sit with me, because pretty much all of the policies we'll be talking about today are policies that they have had some input in helping take a look at. As a general matter, though, one of the things that we have identified as a need is a systemic review of our policies, not just a review on a policy by policy basis, but really a reconsideration of how we are approaching our policies, how we format them so they are professionally uniform, with the appropriate look and feel, in addition to the substantive what changes do we need to make. And so you will find in the agenda a draft of a template, and that template kind of frames what we will be presenting throughout the rest of this session. And part of the reason that we limited our items today to the 10 or so that we have on the agenda is because we didn't want to go too far down the road of revising policies to fit the new template until we've had a chance to hear feedback from you all on whether the template is an approach that you like, or if there are changes to the template that you would want us to make to do something different, because it is a change in how we have organized things. And I can walk you through the template, or I can just turn it over to you and you can ask questions, however you would like to approach that.
How about we walk through it first?
Sure. So, I mean, the template at the top starts off with just a change in the structure. It looks, we've incorporated into it the seal of the Board of Education and dedicated a place for the policy name and number. And we are then breaking up the body of the template into defined sections, which previously it did not have. And this allows us to create a uniform place where you start off with the purpose of the policy, and that's going to be a brief statement, not the body of the policy itself, just something that someone can quickly pick up, look at, and say, yeah, this is what I'm looking for. We've added sections for definitions, because there are times when terms have technical meanings, or meanings that we want to subscribe to them as a system that may not necessarily be the common Merriam-Webster's definition. And so we've created a place for that. The next section is your policy statement itself, and this may have multiple paragraphs underneath it, depending on the nature of the policy. And you'll see one of the policies that we'll get to today does in fact have multiple statements within it. There's then a section for implementation, because one of the things that we've noticed in looking through the policies is there seems to be a blend between policy and regulation. And policy is really where the board lays out its interests and what you believe is best for the system. It is the superintendent's responsibility to work on the implementation of that, and that is done through the regulations. And so the implementation is where you get to direct the superintendent on how how you want the implementation done, but she gets to decide the actual implementation piece in the regulations. And then we add a space for related information. This gives us the opportunity to link to any forms that might be appropriate or come together with the policy. If there's any legal references we want to include, a reference to a state statute or a COMAR section, we can put that into the related information. And then we end with the policy history. That is not new. That has been there. We do have a section there for the related regulations. And this is one thing I do want to highlight. One of the things that I noticed even before I started in this position, when I was preparing to get here, the policies and regulations don't seem to align in terms of where you find them. And one example is if you look at the 300 series, it's not one we're getting to today. The copyright policy is found in the 300 series. The copyright regulation is a 500 number. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because if I'm looking for a regulation to go along with it, I'm going to look for a 300. And even though our system is a wonderful system and very user-friendly and easy to search, it makes a lot of sense to reframe the system so that the policies and regulations are more closely aligned. And having that related regulation section will help create that ease of access that we're looking for in revising this template.
I think this is a huge improvement. I like the look of the new template. I like that implementation is outlined, but it will allow the board to give our intention on implementation, but it will also ensure that superintendent has appropriate space to make the regulations. One change that I think you didn't highlight that I think is important, responsible office, I don't think was in our previous template, and so that will be very important. Yeah, I like this a lot. Do you see anything that is deleted from our previous templates?
The only thing no, I mean, there's no sections because the previous policy didn't really have a template that was followed. The one change that is, it's form, but it is substantive in its form, is the naming convention. So in the policies as they exist, it would say, policy 300.1, and then the next paragraph would be 300.2. We're moving to an A, B, C, D structure instead. And that's, I don't know that that's I mean, if that's something that the board wants to preserve, that 300.1, 300.2, we can certainly work within that.
Thank you.
In that light, though, I do have a question. If we're under, say, C, policy statement, would we then have C1, C2, C?
Yes.
Like that?
Yes.
So in essence, we would kind of just be replacing it with
Correct.
different paragraphs, different outlines. Okay. I too love the implementation, adding that. I think we've always just been assumptive. We just assumed. We assumed the public knew that there's a related regulation. I love that. So I'm very, very happy with that. I love the bottom part with the responsible office, as Mr. Bass said, and the related regulations. And I think you're saying down here, there'll be a hyperlink there. They'll just be able to, I mean, that'll make it really user-friendly for the public. They get there, hyperlink off to the regulation. Love it. So thank you for this.
Yeah, I agree. I think that especially the links will just help us be more organized. People will have a better sense of where to go from each point. So in terms of updating the regulations, so we have a ambitious plan for how we are addressing policies within the policy committee. It's really necessary, but when you're talking about having to go through each regulation as well and figure out if the naming matches with the policy and all of that, what do you, like, realistically, what's the time frame that we're operating or within that?
This is a big project, and it's going to be a rolling project. And so as we move into, once we've reviewed policies, we are going to be, as a team, working to identify the appropriate regulations that need to be updated that correspond. And we have our regular superintendent's advisory committee, which focuses on the regulations. And so the agendas that we will be setting for the supervisory advisory committee will in some ways be driven by the work that's done here. And once the policies are approved by the board.
Just to underscore that, we are going to shift the name of the regulatory group to the Regulation Advisory Committee. Right now, it's called the Superintendent's Advisory Committee, but it's really, it doesn't sort of, when you experience it, it's completely focused on regulatory revision. And so we're going to change that effective July 1 to Regulation Advisory Committee. So we have a parallel structure. We haven't talked about it discreetly, but we may need to change the frequency with which those meetings occur. We're trying to keep pace with the policy committee. So after today, we've already started looking at the 300 regs. So those meetings though right now have been quarterly. So the group only meets 4 times a year, which puts a lot of pressure, just as you all experienced, even more so. So we may need to increase the frequency of the Regulation Advisory Committee starting July 1 so that we can get through the regulatory revisions. There's a little bit more off-cycle engagement and regulations. You all are working through like sort of a series cycle. And we find that because the regulations are often very directly tied to changes in the law in different ways than policy might be, the revision process is sort of all over the place, only in the sense that it's not necessarily, you may not at all be talking about a particular policy, but we are talking about a reg that's associated. An example would be if they make a change to a disciplinary law or statute. And so doesn't change our board policy on student discipline, but it does change our regs. So we're still trying to unpack that together and figure out what that looks like. But we have already made some changes, and we're going to try to keep pace with you as best we can.
And I guess what I think might be helpful for us as a committee too is that, as we're meeting to review, if you have updates to provide, if the Regulation Advisory Committee has met, maybe just providing to us an update on these regs have been
We can send you a
updated.
copy of the notes, really. I mean, it would be
Okay.
easy for us to send
Whatever,
a copy of the
whatever
notes.
is easiest, just so
Result,
that. as
Yeah,
we-
whatever's easiest.
Yeah, as we are having a discussion and then we can be updated too and making sure that we understand.
And legal services also runs that process. And so as I've been sort of trying to build that bridge and support Mr. Blivis as he starts, and his assistant starts on Monday, my assistant Lisa is filling in today, we'll have that sort of in place as well.
So it sounds like we have some consensus on the format of moving forward in our process. So-
Quick question. Just quick, really, just quick, are you going to propose a change to the template for the regulation that mirrors policy?
So I think the regulations were a little bit more, they're a little cleaner.
There is some more uniformity to it. I've been focusing on the policy to be prepared for today. And the superintendent's advisory council is not meeting until May. So I have some time yet to look at it, but I'm absolutely looking at what revisions need to be made to streamline and make sure we're presenting information in the most readable possible way.
Okay, thank you.
Can we move on? All right, then let's move on to agenda item 1.05, policy 303, attendance and absence.
So as we dive into the 300 series items, I just want to start by saying that I know that from the March 22nd meeting, the full list of the 300 series policies that we were going to address were listed. We are not getting to all of them today. And again, that is largely because we didn't want to do a lot of work on policies if we didn't know if the template was what you were interested in. The ones we picked, we hoped would be good examples of how this could look and how it could work with different actions happening on different policies. So with respect to the policy 303, this is the attendance and absence policy. It is a employee-focused, not student-focused policy. And it is our recommendation that we deactivate the policy. And I'm actually going to turn the floor over to Ms. Nguyen to let her talk about the rationale for why.
So a lot of the information that was contained in here is duplicated in our negotiated agreement, and actually is the subject of bargaining. So our concern is that if you place it in multiple areas, once you have that change in your negotiated agreement, you've got to remember all the places you've listed it. So deleting this and allowing that negotiated agreement to stand as your record for this area of work, would be our recommendation for that.
And as an additional point, keep in mind that most of the ones that we're recommending deactivating haven't been looked at in 18 years. And so a lot has changed in 18 years around how boards utilize negotiated agreements to outline expectations for employees. So almost to a rule, anything we're recommending deactivating, we would say doesn't really even currently meet the standard for what a board policy is supposed to focus on, right? So board policies are supposed to focus on like positional interests, belief statements, and philosophies that drive the decisions or actions that happen in a school system. This is not a policy across our industry that you would typically find. And all of the content within is current and up to date in our negotiated agreement.
And then the one thing I would additionally add is, and it's exemplified in this particular policy, there are also statements that are codified in law. And if it's a statement of law, it doesn't need to be a part of our board policy because we're bound to it. And so, the calendar is the creation of the school calendar is something reserved under the law to the board. And a statement in a policy that, that says that the board determines the calendar is really duplicative of what the law already requires.
I guess when I was considering the deactivation of any of our policies, one of the things that I was a little concerned about was if people are accustomed to going in and searching for a particular policy and we've deactivated it someplace else. How are we potentially making the information still accessible?
Yeah, I think from an access standpoint, that's a valid point. I would suggest that we keep the naming of it. We haven't even gotten to the whole website for this, right? So, but understanding that we need to change all of that we would list it. It would live there, memorialized with the date of deactivation and a link to the relevant sort of source material. So deactivated April 2023. See link to negotiated agreement. I think we have a responsibility to point people to.
I really like that.
And we do that with regulations, by the way. So we deactivate regulations. We deactivated a couple of regulations for similar through the Superintendent's Advisory Committee. And that's what we've done. They're memorialized with note that when they were deactivated and why.
And to underscore your point, Ms. Gallagher, there are times when existing policies and regulations become an issue in litigation, and the policy that applies is the policy in place at the time. And so simply removing the policy would not be prudent. It really does need to be moved into an archived space in some way. What the website will end up looking like for that is something obviously we're still working on. But the point is well taken that we do need to maintain the old policies that are no longer applicable in some fashion so they're accessible.
A few questions. Would you say that in 2005, when this was adopted, was it best practice to have policies along these lines, or even at that time, were these things usually described or adjudicated in negotiated agreements?
As Dr. Sergo said, the use of negotiated agreements and how they've been applied has grown over the last 2 decades. I can't speak to the role of how policies were articulated. 18 years ago, I was a second-year attorney and working in New York. So I can't speak to how things were done at that point in time, but just looking at the present day, we see that the role of working conditions and what's negotiated has grown. Even in just the last 1.5 to 2 years, we've seen an explosion of labor relations focus in the business and educational communities.
I have some concerns. I think I have 3 concerns. One is that if we link to the negotiated agreement is extremely complex. And so do we link to the whole agreement, or do we link to that specific section, but then are we missing items if we only link to that specific section? So that's a concern for me. A second area is our negotiations themselves end up being complex. And if the board wanted to have a specific focus on how we work with our staff members on attendance and absence, that won't always come to the forefront in our discussions around negotiations, because there are so many topics to discuss in negotiations. So that's something I'm weighing. A third thing is whether there might be some specific items here that really wouldn't be in a negotiated agreement. Like in 303.3, absence to enroll in summer school, I like and agree with this clause. Teachers who are engaged in a master's degree program are encouraged to attend institutions which offer summer sessions beginning after the close of Frederick County schools. But with that encouraged, that kind of language, I assume, would not make it into a negotiated agreement.
It actually can. I have seen that kind of language where philosophy statements, is what I would call them, or aspirational statements do make their way in because they are an articulation of the intention as agreed between the negotiating parties. So it wouldn't be unusual to include that, but at the same time, that is certainly a statement that could be a statement of the board's interest, and it may be that we want to look again at this particular policy to see if there's any specific paragraphs that need to remain or find their way into the more general personnel policy.
Well, I think you have to go back to the purpose of a board policy. And I'm not sure any of this would meet the threshold for the purpose of a board policy. And so you want to be careful about, so I think the spirit of what you're saying is we want to encourage people to continue to pursue professional learning. We believe in the personal investment. The board believes in having a highly educated and qualified worker. And we believe that the negotiated agreement brings that to bear through our tuition reimbursement, through our partnerships, through all the different ways that we make it easy and accessible for people to pursue advanced learning at whatever their schedule allows, whether they do it in the summer, whether they do it at night, weekends, whenever it is that they do. The way in which people access advanced learning isn't the way it was 18 years ago. And so even the notion that, if you're taking a master's level work, we really want you to go and do that. It's just not even the nature of what higher ed looks like anymore. And so I think the spirit of what you're saying is important. I would argue that perhaps that's already demonstrated through the board's negotiated agreement, which has made it incredibly generous benefits to make sure that people take advantage of higher ed opportunities. So it's just something to think about.
Yeah, I know for a fact, like right now in negotiations, there's the phrase "when possible."
Right.
Instead of encouraged, we say "when possible."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so I'm comfortable with that. I think that it's redundant, that there are parts in here that are already included in the agreement. Two, I think having not been reviewed in 18 years, it's probably contradictory in many cases. So I think we're in some jeopardy there, where we have a board policy that's clearly contradictory to some negotiated agreements that we may have had. Now, I do understand Mr. Bass's concern. I would like to see us have more discussion about where the link takes people.
Yeah.
If this policy is still going to be in there as retired, but it's still going to say attendance and absence, the link, I think, should direct them. They shouldn't have to dig through the 80-page agreement to find it.
Yeah, I'm going to double check what I'm about to
If
say.
it's possible.
I'm going to double check. My recollection, and maybe I'm imagining it, is in the negotiated agreement, the table of contents has direct bookmarks to sections.
It does.
So you can go directly to the
Yeah, it has
section.
hyperlinks
I
there.
believe so, but I want to double check it.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
also a way to tag it in your link so that it would send you directly to that page, the
Yes.
PDF, so you're not filtering through like 60
Right.
some pages.
It's just a matter of working with our
I think
DTI
we can
staff.
take it.
Yeah, that's the thing. I know it's possible. I know companies,
Yeah, it's
our
possible.
company does it, but I don't want to overwhelm our already busy IT department with all the changes we're asking to the website.
And it,
I think that is important that people can go direct, just like we talked about on our building our policy and having hyperlinks there. It's important that it goes right to where.
And I just want to underscore this one point. I think here, some of these things don't even need to be policy because they are sort of a matter of fact, right? So for example, if you think about, and Ms. Lewis gave a great example about the calendar. So, number of working days. You don't need a policy to say the board determines the calendar for all employees. That's a matter of fact. And so typically, again, board policy, going back to that template, is about your philosophy and your position and all of those things. I would even argue that if we were to keep anything from here, it should all be shifted into a regulation. Because it's really the implementation, not the philosophy about why that's important.
I think the only item that really would be philosophical, and it is part of why I raised it, absence to enroll in summer school was probably written at a time that institutions were not offering online learning in any kind of robust way. The vast majority of folks went to, been accessing programs online. But I do think that's a philosophical idea around both encouraging our staff members to pursue higher learning, and that we have either hope or expectation that this be done outside of the traditional workday. And
It would have to be. They're teaching.
I don't know. I wonder how something would work if it were, I mean, this is so specific, but I don't know, an online class that starts at 3 p.m. and, there's generally some work that continues in the school through 3:30.
They would be late to go.
That's right.
I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying too. And to me, I'm not sure that belongs in a policy statement, but we do have other areas where the next one we're looking at is around certification. We have some policies and whether those stay in place around reimbursement for furthering education. I feel like there are places where we can put in that philosophy around encouraging professional growth, continued learning, that doesn't necessarily have to be part of this particular policy, in my opinion.
And I think, Paula, the last point I'd make to just sort of think about this is the importance of board policy is to set the tone and the direction of all the work that becomes associated with it, right? So when you think about even policy 117, which is a more recent policy, that is going to have far-reaching impact in making shifts and adjustments to how lots of things happen in the system because it's an anchor. And so I think that there are lots of examples where all of the philosophy and the sentiment that this already exists in the system. Our national board certification and the way that we take care of the local share, things that are driven by the law with the blueprint around, the career ladder is the biggest philosophy statement around become more advanced in your degree acquisition and your certification, and you'll advance in your career. I think there are a lot of existing things to say, this is already in place, this direction is already occurring, this exists. So it's just something to think about.
Are we okay to move on from?
Well, do we want to take action on?
Deactivating.
So, would the action be deactivating this policy and providing a link to the areas of the negotiated agreement that relate?
We can provide the link, or I worry also about the technical aspect of it. It may be that we want to reserve the links to the regulations and we leave the link to the negotiated agreement to the negotiated agreement itself with a statement of, consult with your union representative to understand the content of your agreement. That is really their purview, and I would be cautious about, pushing in that direction. But I mean,
I think your pause is actually a wise one. I would say that the negotiated agreement evolves at a frequency that's greater than policy, and so.
So in that vein, I would say, why don't we do that? And then you just bring it back, and it actually, then we see it
Okay.
in its form, and that'll probably help us in all our future decisions around deactivating policy. We'll actually see policy deactivated, whatever paragraph reference, talk to your whatever. But then we can see that, then we can move to say,
In
that's
the actual policy.
yes,
Mhm.
yes.
So you're
Before just moving to deactivate it and then expecting, we pull it up later and look at it and go, I'm not really comfortable with that. Well,
Yeah, I mean, it's 18 years old. No one's looking at this policy.
Yeah.
Honestly. I mean, I'm being very candid.
Yeah.
So,
I'm
because
really
if
thinking
someone
about
was to look
future.
at it, if someone was to look, let's say someone was to look at it and reference it in any way, and let's say they reached out to legal services or HR, we'd say, well, none of that's go over here for that. That policy isn't relevant or up to date, or we point that, so we would automatically point them there anyway. So it's really the will of the committee around whether or not when we deactivate it, but I would argue that it's actually functionally deactivated itself, because people aren't referencing it, because it isn't a contemporary portrait of our system approach.
And I'm not even addressing this specific policy. I'm all for deactivating,
Yeah.
and I think it's redundant and contradictory. But for future
Absolutely.
deactivations, it wouldn't bother me to
where it
see,
Yeah.
here's how it's gonna look.
Gotcha.
That's just my point.
But then our next step is a little unclear to me. Does this stay on the website active until our next time as policy committee looking at what you're proposing as the link if we deactivate it?
So I think that's up to the committee to decide. If you want to deactivate it now, you can make that determination, and we will take the action after to, pull it out and move it, and take all of the steps we've talked about making sure it's archived and so forth. If you would rather wait until the next meeting, we can prepare here's what it will look like when you actually deactivate it, and you will be able to see it. And we can put this back on the agenda for the next meeting, which is May 17th. That's going to be an active meeting. But we can certainly do that, and we can take the month between and be prepared to present that.
Since I presented this issue, I will say, or could we move to deactivate it and entrust through our words, through our motion, that it get done? Because I'm also aware that there are other policies we're going to talk about today that are recommended deactivated.
Yes.
And I hate to place roadblocks in front of the work we're trying to do today. So I would be comfortable with making the motion that we vote to deactivate this policy and entrust you to provide the necessary language and links for the public, for our employees and staff necessary with that
And
deactivation.
because I think it's important to address sort of Mr. Bass's interest, and sort of what I hear underscoring this that I would offer is that you'll see, and I know if you've looked at the materials, you notice that there are some places where we're recommending that policy to be deactivated, but that the spirit of it lives somewhere else. So we have policy 300, which is personnel. And there are a lot of these sort of little breadcrumb policies, substitute teacher policy, maybe even this policy, but anything related to personnel, we can also fold in. So Mr. Bass, if your interest is to make sure that there's a clear statement from the board around our commitment to our employees, continuing their education and growing, we can revise policy 300 to sort of pull the spirit of the ones that we're deactivating in an appropriate way. So I also wouldn't want the board to think, well, if we deactivate something, it sort of has disappeared completely. We can sort of hold on to some of these pieces that are related to our personnel, and then they can show up in a revision to 300, which is not on deck today, And the reason it's not on deck is that we think is a very robust policy that we wanted to make sure we also heard all these pieces today. Anything that's deactivated here, you can also direct us to say, can you find a way to incorporate the spirit of this that we're deactivating into 300? That's our personnel policy. And so I just wanted to offer that as a potential solution to address all the interests.
I like that.
So if I can make a recommendation, I think that Mr. Rose, your suggestion is a good one. And the reality is between now and the next meeting, we will be doing our work to deactivate. And if you find what we have done is not to your satisfaction, we'll put it back on the agenda for the next meeting and we will revisit it. It's not like because we've made a decision here.
You can't ever talk about it again.
Exactly.
Oh, sorry, deactivate.
So we can keep this moving along, get things, and then come back and revisit as needed.
I fully support that, because one of the reason I ran for the position in the first place is coming from a business world. The thing that drives me crazy is paralysis by analysis, and I don't want to fall into that trap. So I would support my motion. Just recant.
I think there's a lot of policies to review. I'm not looking to, I want us to do the work that needs to be done. And I haven't seen the link. I haven't reviewed the negotiated agreement with a emphasis on these items. And so I would not be supporting that motion.
That's why you're the chair.
I feel comfortable moving forward with your recommendation. I think that, we will have the opportunity once it's updated, which I know you all are making all of this work a high priority. You can shoot us an email, maybe you can test out the link to see how it looks, and that way, hopefully we can.
And I think I would just emphasize your statement that said, just because we're voting to do this doesn't mean that if Mr. Bass is unhappy with what he sees in the resultant, he can't bring it back up and we address it.
And frankly, Mr. Bass, if you don't feel like what we've done, I would encourage you not to wait until the 17th. Respond back to the email we send you with the information, and we will be, continue to work on updating and improving.
That works. If we're taking a formal vote, I'm voting no, but I certainly understand your intentions and this collaboration.
I think we had it. I think it's
How about
too
yes?
Ready to move to the next?
Yes.
So 1.06 on the agenda, which is policy 304 certification. This is an example of a place where we are proposing revisions to the policy. We're not proposing to remove it. I think what you'll see when you look at this is a more clear statement from the outset of what the policy relates to. This is relating to the classification of certifications. We provide some definitions to help articulate and understand, which I don't think was present in the policy as it previously existed. And then, I will turn again to Ms. Nguyen and allow her to kind of walk through more of the substance of it.
Sure. So we recently brought this to policy committee, I want to say in January or February of this year, because of MSDE's addition to the adjunct certificate, which is basically something that supports our educators mostly in the career and technology field, where they are experts in their field of, say, automotive technology, but they may not hold that bachelor's degree requirement. So that certificate option was tailored for their needs. So we had that added most recently. With this, a lot of the information, we've obviously put it into the new template there, but then the information that gets into the basic certificate regulations is information that we are recommending be moved over to the regulation side of it. There is still an update coming out from MSDE where they are going to change the language of certificate to licensure. So that information housed in the regulation will allow us to go in and update that singular word change to that piece of it. but we're not actually removing anything. We're just kind of moving it from the policy into the reg piece.
Yeah, and I think just to, again, where you see things cross out, that's regulatory language. And so there is an existing 304-1, I think it should be hyperlinked in this, it's not hyperlinked, it's just in blue. But that we're gonna update that reg to make sure that everything that we crossed out moves over there.
And then looking at the bottom, you'll see that the related information, this is an example of where we populate the COMAR sections, the section of the education article that applies. And then in the policy history, we've got the designated office. This is obviously a human resources piece. And the link, I think we had intended that will be a link once the regulation is revised.
Does that regulation cover most of what is outlined
Everything,
here that
yes.
says regulation in our policy?
Correct.
I support these changes. I think it's well outlined and, clarifies what we're looking at with certification.
I think this is a good example of what you're proposing for the change, so I think this is a great example. Not to be picky, I'll only point out there's one typo on C, where C has been indented.
Yes, I noticed that as well.
I saw that too.
We saw that.
So,
We'll pull that in.
that's it.
So the next agenda item is 1.07. This is the travel and mileage reimbursement policy. And again, this is a place where we are looking at what was in policy that's really more regulation. So the existing policy referred to the reimbursement rate as the rate set by the IRS, but that may not be the rate that we want to always be in place. We may choose to, set a different rate for whatever reason, whether it's because we negotiate something different with the associations, or because MSDE comes down and says, well, this is the rate we want our mileage reimbursement to be set at. So we feel like it doesn't belong in policy. It really should exist in regulation. The existence of a travel and reimbursement policy, though, is important. And this does articulate for those who are looking at it, what the expectations are with respect to what will and what won't be reimbursed from the perspective of the board.
I think these are excellent changes as well.
I agree.
And I just want to underscore, to the implementation part that you raised, Mr. Bass, this is an example of sort of what implementation statement should look like in policy, right? Where the superintendent has to go and do a regulation that covers these items. And that's a really helpful way, instead of putting all the regulatory language in there. Tell the superintendent what you want that reg to include.
Yeah, and I think I like this language. I think it's appropriate. The superintendent is directed to establish a regulation setting the travel and mileage reimbursement rates. I'm going to support this. I'm curious if a board wanted to give some direction on this, such as in this really tight, two main extremes. In a really tight budget, we may need to offer less than the IRS reimbursement, or let's really take care of our employees. Let's go a little beyond the IRS reimbursement. Would this policy allow for that? Or is it truly, it's directing the superintendent to establish the regulation. Do you think this policy would allow for any direction from the board?
It absolutely would, because I don't think the policy needs to be so static in its statement as to what the amount that the board wants the system to reimburse employees who have travel or mileage expenses. We have communication constantly, right? You have the opportunity to express to us that, hey, we're looking at, we know you get to set, you're setting the rate in your regulation, but we feel like that the rate should be here, and you can account for that and make that statement in a number of other ways. It doesn't have to be set in a static policy that if we have X happen, then we will do a higher rate. Or if our budget is below this threshold, we will, reduce the rate. There are other ways that you can share the interest with the superintendent as she builds out the regulations. That doesn't require it to be stated in a static document like the policy. Because as Dr. Sergo has indicated, changing the regulations is something we can do relatively easily. Changing the policy is a much more, process-driven event.
I appreciate that, because I think we don't want any of our policies to communicate we're making these like minute by minute decisions about how we're handling. Like, this is setting the vision and the policy purpose direction from the board. So rather than being specific about that, I appreciate the response that that's something that, particularly when it falls in regulation, communication about, we're always having communication about like finances and, as we're deciding our budget, and if it's a bad year or a good year, and there are things that we would have to be talking about regardless.
Fully agree, but in general, when you're talking about that, regulation can be more, maybe you said nimble, or it would, as you said, I think it would require more than the quarterly regulation meeting. So I'm encouraged that you guys are looking at more frequent regulation meetings.
Agreed.
I support the changes.
I do as well.
So the next policy is 308. This is item 1.08 on the agenda. It's 308, personal and academic freedom. We are recommending deactivation, and because this was such a brief policy, we articulated for each item the rationale for it, and I can let Ms. Nguyen talk you through that.
So the personal freedom is actually part of our non-discrimination policy, and so we want to make sure it's housed in that location appropriately. And then when you get into the academic freedom, this is already reflected in our collective bargaining agreement with FCTA. However, due to the blueprint legislation that is going to provide our assistant principals opportunities to be back into the classroom, we want to make sure it's reflected in their agreement as well. So it would be most appropriate in those two locations. And then obviously our personnel records, that should be information housed within our personnel policy 300 that we intend to bring back to you with that added information. That would then leave this policy there, which is we've recommended it be deactivated. Any questions?
There were two issues that may or may not have fallen under this policy previously that I'll raise, and I'd be interested. I think in either late 2019 or early 2020, there was a high school history teacher who had a Nazi flag up in his classroom, and not just I don't know, for one particular, but as a display, ongoing. And then, oh yeah, it was at Thomas Johnson High School. I believe it was January of 2020, maybe February.
It predates you guys.
Yeah, wow. Other school systems have had the same problem.
And but the fascinating thing, there's a lot of aspects here. One of the fascinating things is then the teacher was ordered to take it down. Okay, I mean, I think as a person, I'm glad the teacher was ordered to take it down. But yeah, would any of that fall under academic freedom?
My understanding is that incident resulted in a policy being created for around teaching controversial topics.
Yes. 516 or something like that. Yeah.
So I mean, so those kinds of things do happen, and they do result sometimes in change being made.
That content is now covered.
And okay, and so that kind of situation would not fall under this personal and academic freedom policy.
It's more or less been replaced.
Yeah, it is, to some degree, it has been replaced with the policy regarding teaching controversial topics. I guess the the piece that's causing me some hesitancy in responding is because I don't know why that teacher was displaying that flag. Is it because the teacher had a personal, sincere belief in support of that position, or was it because it was a part of the historical lesson? So-
It was a history teacher.
This policy is really oriented around the individual's personal beliefs and not, infringing upon that, as opposed to, what we allow, what we think is appropriate for teaching in the classroom.
That's fair. The second item more recently that came up, and I just wonder if it relates here, when FCTA had put items in mailboxes, I just wonder if a teacher in non-teaching time had put political material in a mailbox, whether that would have been protected by this personal and academic freedom policy.
Well, we do have the political activity policy.
We do have the political activity policy. That is a policy that I have flagged as one that needs to be looked at and reviewed again, because of recent discussion on the subject of placing materials in teacher mailbox. I think that there will be times when policies will interact with each other. I think the fact that we have a political activity policy will protect the board with respect to the understanding and expectation for the circumstance you're describing, which, could that fall under the personal freedom or provision in this article? Potentially, but we have a different policy that addresses it. And that's not to say that those two policies are necessarily conflicting or inconsistent, but because we have one policy in place that addresses it, we don't necessarily need the second. Action.
Yeah, I think this is the same motion.
Mhm.
Yep.
And so you'll be showing links to these three other areas. What will the action be?
This is more of this is again about, this will just be policy that would just be deactivated. The content will go into the places we've noted. I think that the idea of when you deactivate something, linking to other places is one that the board may want to take up. That's going to be your standard operating procedure, or in places where you think it is incredibly important to the end user that they see. Again, it's 18 years old. I'm not sure it's being actively used in any way because there are other places where this content lives. We can certainly do that if it has to the board.
Kind of goes back to your first comment about,
Right.
is anyone ever even clicking on this link? Because they're aware that it is covered under
Right.
our other established policies.
Mm-hmm.
But are you proposing, like, it says 308.1 personal freedom, this belongs in the non-discrimination policy. Are you proposing that the website would then reflect 308.1 personal freedom? And now you're saying that it wouldn't be a link to the non-discrimination policy. I'm wondering what we would see on the website if someone clicked on policy 308 going forward.
So I would argue that they shouldn't see anything and that we just deactivate it. And so if someone was to have a question about personal freedom, the policy they'll go and look at is non-discrimination. I think the idea of linking is important. If you believe people are going to go to the source file first, I'm not sure that they are, but that's really.
Because are you arguing that 308 will no longer exist? Like 308 won't be there. I wouldn't want them to link it and hit the link and there's a blank.
No,
I'm saying, I understand if you're saying it just won't be there anymore. And I wonder if, just a point of discussion,
Yeah.
should we consider a sunset on it? Where we said, okay, for,
So I will say, and I certainly want to turn it over to Ms. Willis, but what other school systems typically do in this case is and there's a whole separate conversation about our website. Well, what most school systems do is they have a landing page on their website around their policy and regulation. That is somewhat of a news feed. And what that would look like is it would say at the top, current links to current policies that have been revised, and there's a list. Links to recently deactivated policy, and there's a list. And so we can sort of memorialize the work of the policy committee in that way. And so people, when you talk about something, people would see sort of a running list of the action that you've taken.
And I do believe in the value of an online archive. I mean, these files, what are a tenth of a megabyte? I mean, they're tiny. We could house millions of them and not use up any real space. So there is value in it as long as it is clearly articulated that this is no longer, as of this date, this is not an active policy. And Mr. Bass, to your point, I think we need to take a second look at the linking and what we are going to be linking to. And what I don't want to do is overwhelm the end user as well, right? I mean, it's important that they're able to find the information and that the references here belongs in the non-discrimination policy. Maybe we need to add to that what that policy number is to make that easier to find. I don't want to, at the same time as I want to have transparency and ease of access, I also don't want to overwhelm the end user. And so I think we may need to take that, that feedback from you. And, as we work on it over the next month, you'll obviously have a chance to see it, before it goes, we'll make sure you have a chance to see it before it goes live. And we'll get that feedback from you if you feel like more needs to be done.
I love that idea in regards to transparency, that there's a landing page that I love that idea that talks about our actions, our most recent actions. So I really like that addition to the public that provides transparency of what the policy committee has done.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't assume that the public is not looking at, particularly this policy. I think personal and academic freedom is probably a policy a lot of folks are looking at. And it's on us as a board that we haven't reviewed it since 2005.
Well, then I think then memorializing this version of it, the deactivated version, is important. So when people open it, the assumption is they're reading everything. They open it, they know it's been deactivated, but where to go next.
Yes, I think that's what.
Yeah, I think we're all saying the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, you'll let us know whether it's going to be a link or whether it's going to be telling people where to go, and I'll be interested in seeing that.
Thinking about the links too, I do, as we're talking about it, I'm thinking about, okay, then anytime we make an update to something and the link might change, then we
You don't
have
want
to
a
go
dead
back
link.
and
That's
correct.
we have had some
Go
issues
back
with dead
to
linking.
That's
all of
true.
those
Yeah, we have
policies
had some
that
issues
At one
with dead
time, we linked in 2023, and now it's 2040, and everything has changed again, or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just making up numbers, but I
No, that's a
appreciate
great
your point,
point.
and I think at least being able to direct people where to go, maybe not with the direct links, unless it's something that I feel like it's very difficult for them to find.
That makes sense to me.
Good point. All right, I agree.
Okay, so we're good with 308.
So the next item is 1.09 on the agenda. It is policy 312, which relates to substitute teachers. This is another policy we're recommending deactivation. And again, I'll turn to Ms. Nguyen for substance.
So we're recommending that this language be shifted to our policy 300 that we plan to bring back to you. That would be most appropriately housed there, along with our other personnel things.
I support that change.
And I think that, again, that's a perfect example of people would happen to click on this link, they'd see, oh, it's been moved to personnel. Yeah, perfect.
And so the next item on the agenda, 110, policy 313, honors and awards. This is a recommendation of a revision, again, to incorporate the new policy template. If you look at the existing policy, it really, we're amplifying it as well. It's not just a We're just shuffling the pieces and fitting them into the new template structure. But we're trying to amplify this a little bit with some additional, clarity and information about what the board values. And that's really what you see in C1. And Mr. Rose, you had asked if we have policies with multiple, will we have, numbered paragraphs? Absolutely. One of the things as a lawyer, I like having numbered paragraphs because it makes it really easy to refer when someone says, well, what about this? Well, that's in, this policy C2, as opposed to having to say the second paragraph on the third page, right? And the other thing I would highlight here is that, you'll see we actually, in looking at the regulation that related to this, we realized there was a piece of policy statement in the regulation. And so we're going to pull that out of the regulation and put it where it belongs.
And this is another example where we got to get the numbering aligned. So we'll probably at some point change the regulation from 100-04 to in the 300 series, so that it's aligned. And this is another place where you want this to be nimble. The way in which the board, the spirit of how we recognize and celebrate our staff is constantly evolving. So what this doesn't compromise is we believe in recognition. We believe in celebrating our staff in a variety of ways, and the superintendent is charged with making sure that that occurs.
I support these changes, and I appreciate, that this can go both ways. You have found policy language and regulation that you're pulling out and putting into policy. That's good.
Yeah.
Agree. I appreciate that comment.
Before we move on, though, a question about our deactivation of policies. Do we need to put these proposed deactivations on our action consent agenda for the full board or do we as a policy committee have the authority to deactivate policy?
I would think it would be most appropriate to take it to the full board because it's board policy, although you act in their behest, but let's confirm that from a procedural standpoint.
And then I guess if that is the case, we probably will need to have some discussion at a board meeting about just this process that we're going through so that I can provide an update during our policy committee updates, but as we're moving forward, if that's the case, just making sure everybody's on the same page.
Broadly speaking, I definitely agree to include it in a board meeting. Also because these have been listed as discussion or information discussion and not as action items.
Yeah.
So I would be more comfortable with this coming to the board.
And I think it would be important, obviously, to have the discussion prior to us placing any of this on the consent agenda. Because that would raise all kinds of.
Yes, very much so. Agree. What I don't want to happen though is a complete rehash of all of the
Right,
discussions that we
I
had
would say-
as well.
I think they have to, that's the reason they entrust the policy committee to make, just like we entrust curriculum and instruction.
Correct.
There's a reason we're entrusted. I think we owe them an explanation, but I don't think, send that back. I think that's.
Right.
So having this as a discussion before we move into.
Well, probably what we should do is we should put it in a work session, and then it can be on that evening's consent agenda.
Yeah, and I think right to your point, and you would want to talk to Sue about this, is sort of, the intent isn't to redo the policy committee meeting with the full board, right?
Right.
That's the whole purpose of the committee structure. And so I think if through the policy, through your comments at the board meeting, even next week, when you say the policy committee met, you would certainly say, these are the policies we've been looking through. We've made some preliminary recommendations that we'll be bringing to the board for a consent item. I do think that would be the typical structure, but we'll confirm.
That would be my recommendation if we can pull that off. We could just put an explanation into a work session and then it'd still be included on that evening's consent agenda. It would make it more efficient.
Yeah, makes sense. Ready for the next? Okay.
Yes.
So the next item on the agenda is 1.11, policy 322, asbestos removal. you know, we actually had some real robust back and forth about whether we even need an asbestos policy. But, you know, given the age of the buildings that we have, the very real reality that asbestos is probably in some of them still. We felt that, you know, as a working group, that it was still important to have a policy with respect to the remediation and removal of asbestos. And so we took what existed and we kind of beefed it up a bit. In fact, there was a piece about asbestos that didn't appear in the policy or in the regulations. It appeared, I think, in our calendar.
Yes.
And we're like, well, there's this information about asbestos in our calendar, and it's nowhere else. So we said, you know, let's work with that and really beef up this asbestos policy to make it, you know, a more clean and clear statement of what our expectations are. And then there is the implementation piece of, you know, there was no real way for someone to report a concern about asbestos. I mean, obviously you can always report a concern to a supervisor or, you know, to OSHA or to the Maryland OSHA, but there was nothing in place, you know, no structure for us. So we're suggesting that we create that.
Two questions, I guess. So one, is this a 300 series?
Well, yes. Right, so
I
where's
understand
the, right, I know, because that was I'm like, why is this? So I would say because it is related to an employees, it's sort of the protection and administration of employee work behaviors. So in black the black text is what we received. That was the sort of the base we were working from. And you can see, I think to Mr. Lewis's point, the only thing this said when you clicked on it initially was that employees who removed asbestos could get a respirator and had to use them, and they had to file the law. That was all that was on it. It was 3 sentences on the policy. So we, number one, consulted with Dr. Lebo around like, what is our current approach? And so I think if you were to say that, let me go to the balcony view for a moment. When you think about the big picture for our website and policy and how does an employee know where to look for information, if something is about me as the employee, we're going to direct you to get to the 300 series. So 300 series is about anything related to personnel. And so if I'm an employee and I want to know what my rights are or what the system believes what kind of work I should be doing, that lives in the 300 series. It could go in a facilities type of a policy, but because it's about the work that someone does, it currently, I'm assuming that's why it's been there. It hasn't been looked at in 18 years. So it's hard for us to know what the original thinking was of that, but I'm guessing that if it was related to employee rights, working conditions, or expectations, it landed in the 300 series. You could move it.
It could live elsewhere.
Yes.
I guess that's just my question, because it is related to employee health and safety, right? But it's also about the health and safety and well-being of and our facilities. And
This policy is more about how we handle removal, not our philosophy about whether someone should work in a building with asbestos, or it's just about how do we handle, when someone has to remove asbestos, now thinking about all we know now about asbestos removal and the importance of certified staff doing the remediation. We wanted to, I'm imagining the philosophy at the time, looking at this 18 years later, was to make sure it was really clear that as an employer, that we were going to try to take care of people who had to do this work. But it's not about whether or not we have facilities with asbestos. It's more about
We're going to have to focus on the title of the policy, asbestos removal.
I think the implementation you have here is very appropriate, with the superintendent providing the regulation to establish a procedure for employees to report allegations, which will be appropriately investigated. I support all these changes.
As well.
So the next item is 112, 1.12, policy 324, the reporting of allegations of fraud or illegal activity. Again, this is a revision, not a decommission. And it's, again, just trying to articulate the board's position on this and the expectation that we act in an appropriate way. We didn't really eliminate any of what was in the existing policy. You'll see that the black text there's not much strike through in the black text, because it was valuable and important information. So in some ways, this is an example of taking the existing regulation and just fitting it into the template that we're going to be broadly applying. We did feel like there was some more that could be said, though, to really strengthen this, because this is such an important overall subject as it goes to the heart of the credibility and faith that the public has in us, in you as a board, and us as servants to the system, in making sure that we're doing things the right way.
And from an implementation perspective, you may say, well, what does this look like now? What is the process? So we do have a Lighthouse is an anonymous reporting mechanism that most school systems utilize. And so what we actually got one this week. And so what happens is when an employee wants to make an allegation of fraud, waste, or abuse, which typically includes, it's not always something as dramatic as someone taking money or embezzlement. It's, people are saying they're on leave, people are saying they're working and they're on leave, or, some sort of, they're not coming into work on time, and whatever it might be, and they want to trigger an investigation. Those reports from Lighthouse come in, they go to myself as the chief of staff, our chief financial officer, staff in the financial services division, and Ms. Wynn. And so we look at them and we make sure that they're investigated, assigned to an appropriate investigator, and then we report back and close those loops. So most of the things, it's very infrequent, but when they come in, they're typically around things like leave abuse, are the most typical kinds of allegations that come in, and we do have an existing process for that.
Questions? This works.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
So the next item is 1.13. This is not a presentation of an amendment to policy. This is bringing forward the public comment section of 102, policy 102. And really for us, this is an opportunity to get feedback and have some discussion about what a drafted policy might look like, with the intention that we will bring to the committee at the next session a draft of a proposed policy. During the board meeting last week, I took very careful notes of the comments of all of the board members and of those who gave public comment on the subject, and that includes consideration of some of the emails that we've received on this topic. The things that kind of stood out to me as the interests are more clarity in the policy, that there's some vagueness to it, the need to balance and respect the work life of the staff versus the importance of hearing from our community, consideration of the amount of time that's allocated both individually to the person, but also to just receiving public comment as a whole. How can we enhance and modernize the sign-up process and make better use of existing, technology to make this process more efficient, and finding other ways to bring public comment into the record without there actually having to necessarily be a person standing at a podium making a presentation. Those were the kind of the broad themes, the things that I pulled out of what was said from you all up on during your comments on this subject.
Can I ask one question before we go into the public comment section of this? Do we think there's going to be another time for us to look at policy 102 for the other aspects of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I was gonna say this too, is, that today, I think we focus on the public comment portion, but there have been some requests to look at some other items around our meeting structure, and so we might as well be comprehensive.
You can look at everything.
Look at everything, but today, if we can focus on the public comment so that we can maybe get some.
And I think, Mr. Bass, to your point, it's hard to talk about the structure of public comment without talking about your meeting agenda, right? And so sort of where they live inside of that. So I would argue that there is a relationship between talking about your meeting agenda format, which is 102.3 in the policy, your regular meeting agenda, because I think part of your commitment is to thinking about where this particular aspect of board meetings lives, right? So is it the beginning of the meeting? Is it the end of the meeting? Should it be before the board business? Should it be after the board business? And sort of what we've been doing is really looking across the state at what other districts are doing. We are happy to offer you thoughts. If you have a particular direction you want us to go, we could tell you what other systems are doing if you're looking for anchor examples. So really, I think there is, I would say that there's a relationship between your meeting agendas and your public comment that's important to consider.
And Ms. Rouse, it was actually my intention when we brought the regulation revisions, or the policy revisions rather, to the next session, that it was going to be a more comprehensive look at the entirety of the policy. Because once we've opened it up, we might as well look at the whole thing. So that was always my intention, but as Ms. Gallagher indicated, the focus for today was just let's talk about the public comment piece.
And so, I mean, I had been thinking too about just how we best go about this conversation. I think Mr. Blivis, you captured a number of the things that I had jotted down as well, just in terms of like what we need to consider. So to me, it's around, you mentioned this, timing and the amount of time that we're giving for public comment, so where it falls in the agenda, and also whether we're expanding the amount of time we're giving for public comment, the sign-up process and how we're prioritizing, if we're prioritizing beyond first come, first serve. And we've had some discussion about students, individuals speaking about agenda items, or is it just come in, sign up, and that's the order we go in until whatever. Remote, so are we doing only people who show up? Are we doing a form email? Do you want to consider a call-in option or not? What parameters we're establishing for organizations? So we've had some discussion with the board. Does an organization need to provide their bylaws or some evidence that they are an established organization? And then, there was something that Karen shared with us about Cecil County, I think, has some other opportunities for engagement. So the limited open forum, I don't know if that's something we want to consider, but as we're talking about ways for us to engage with and get feedback from the public, whether there are other opportunities to do. So
Yeah,
I don't know if
that's I think in line with what we've discussed. One thing to think about, I think, because this notion of time has been a conversation. It's really splitting hairs when you think about the difference between the number of people you allow to speak in time. They're related, right? So for example, a neighboring county has a limit of 20 people. First come, first serve, it's 20 people. 10 are reserved for individuals. 10 are reserved for individuals who want to comment on agenda topics for the evening. 5 are reserved for individuals who want to talk about whatever they want, and 5 are reserved for organizations. So you've got 20 people at an average of 2 or 3 minutes. So essentially, without saying plainly, we allot 60 minutes for public comment, they allot 60 minutes for public comment. So one of the things that we would love to hear your thoughts on is, are you looking for an unlimited? Are you looking at a number of people, and do you want to prioritize within that? Do you want to prioritize first come, first serve for people on agenda topics? We've heard the board say we want to prioritize students. So one of the things we need a little bit of direction on is number of minutes, number of people. They're really the same thing, honestly, minutes or people. And then do you want to have a prioritization within that? Those are some of the things that I think we would need some direction on to offer you some revisions.
And to underscore that every place does it a little bit differently. There's another neighboring jurisdiction that allocates time, slots on the agenda for union representatives. And if the union representatives don't take them, then they become available to the general public. So, I mean, I say that not to say that we need to have a space, dedicated for union representatives, but just that the floor is open for us to be really creative and, figure out what it is, you as a board want. And we have a lot of flexibility to do that.
Just so you're aware, we did receive an email. I guess they weren't CC'd on it. We got an email from Catherine this morning that linked us to 10 other districts and what they're doing. So that's very helpful.
Yeah.
We still want to do what we do, whatever we decide we want to do, but it is helpful to see what the 10 of these other districts are doing.
And I think to your point that you've raised, I think Mr. Lewis raised earlier, which is what's the loop closure on public comment? And so there's also some districts take different approaches. Some districts require that someone from the system basically responds, if you will, to any public comment with, an acknowledgement. Many districts require any public comment be provided in digital form so that there's a record. So if you go into board docs, you see the name of the person and you see a written or video link to their comment so that it's memorialized. And we also have seen some districts, look at ways in which they can, I don't want to say discourage, because I don't want this to be misconstrued, but if they have a limited number of slots, they do have some rules in place around if you've given public comment at the last meeting, others go before you at the next, so that they ensure that there is a wide variety of voices. So again, the floor is yours around what you want to do, and there are a plethora of examples of how this is done. No two places do it the same, which sort of says something.
Well, so maybe that's where we start, just like timing and priority, because I do think, like you said, they go
Sure.
hand in hand, how we move forward with some of our recommendations, so. Thoughts?
The floor is yours.
I think I'd like to see us extend beyond the 30 minutes. It's been so rare that 30 minutes is sufficient to hear from the public. I mean, as a starting point for our discussion, I would advise 45 minutes, aiming for that 6:15 p.m. to 7 p.m. Timeframe feels right to me. That we open our meeting and we have some preliminary items, including the Pledge of Allegiance and sometimes some system recognitions. But yeah, that 6:15 to 7 timeframe allows folks who are working a typical work schedule to come to the meeting. It also allows plenty of time for the board to engage in the other work at hand.
So that 45 minutes would equate to about 15 individuals at 3 minutes each. So just, again, trying to keep that in mind in terms of understanding the relationship between the two. And so if you're going to limit it to 45, then you are going to want to have a conversation about how you prioritize. I know that the board has an interest in equity and access. And so if you do first come, first serve, it's a little bit, that doesn't always create equity and access, because it's another piece to think about.
I have some ideas on that, but I wonder if you guys should speak to timing.
That was going to be my actual question for you, because we have already gotten some emails back from the public. And I would like more research into Supreme Court decisions around First Amendment limitations and whether how we can, we've had some people challenging us on prioritizing based on the comment, I mean, the content of their comments, that it's construed that we're going to prioritize them last, or they won't even be allowed within that, say, 45-minute time frame because of, and my understanding to the Supreme Court decision is if we were specifically doing that, if we were prioritizing based on content, that's a violation. But I would like more feedback from you on that type of issue.
So the board meetings are considered limited public forum, so they're not open to any discussion. Someone couldn't come in and off the street and say, I want to talk about housing policy, because housing policy is not the purview of this board. So it is a limited public forum, and in a limited public forum, the board has a lot more freedom to exercise discretion, as long as the discretion, you're absolutely right, Mr. Rose, that it has to be neutrally applied. So we could not say to one individual, we'll let you speak on this topic, and then to another individual who stands in opposition on that topic, we won't let you. We can't do that. That's where we would run into a challenge in terms of overbearing restriction. We do have the ability to limit the scope of public comment. We can limit it to just the agenda items. We don't have to give unfettered right to speak about every board topic. That I do believe that is within the scope of the research that I and my team, She was in the back. She's sitting back there. She's been helping me do this research, and we do think there is room to impose limits if that's the direction the board wants to go. So in terms of being able to say, well, we want to prioritize students first, or those who want to speak to a particular agenda item first, there is room for the board to make that determination.
I think out loud.
But I really do like the approach that you shared, Dr. Sergo, about, the 20 speakers and prioritizing 10 on the agenda items. We're here for a board meeting for a reason. We've set our agenda items for that night for a reason. We want to hear feedback if there is feedback on those agenda items in particular. I think that, to me, should be a top priority, regardless of who the speaker is, student, community member, parent, teacher. And then, allowing some of those speaker slots to be for non-agenda items. You can come and speak about whatever. We've had that frequently for hours, right? And so, I've wavered on limiting the amount of time for public comment, because I do think that we have been elected to listen to our community members. But I think there are other ways that we can get that feedback too. So we've talked about submitting, the form or the email, and that's another way that people would have to submit their comments.
Well, you have an example here today of that, right? So you've uploaded to Board Docs an email that you received.
Yep.
That's pretty traditional that people would, you can just say, send comments to board@fcps.org. And if they're tagged perhaps in a certain way or titled in a certain way, public comment submission for 5/17 board meeting would be very easy to have that sort of turned into a PDF and uploaded to Board Docs. So you do have some options to put into the public record. People submitted written comments as well.
And we've run out of time. Like, people just start leaving anyways, right? Like, we've had packed boardrooms. We only allot for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we've been moving to the end, but people aren't staying when it's 11 o'clock.
And I'm going to give what may appear to be two very inconsistent statements. The ability and the opportunity to submit written statements that go into the record means that the public can provide more information, because 3 minutes is a reasonable amount of time, but there's often more to be said and more that someone wants to say, and they could easily go well beyond 3 minutes. Having that ability to put something in writing and submit it that way allows for that more robust statement. At the same time, I would recommend that you watch some of the public comments sessions where the time is limited to 2 minutes a person, because that, even though that cuts the amount of time from 3 to 2, it also means that you go from 15 people to, if we adopt the 45 minutes, to 22 people. And so now 7 more individuals have an opportunity to stand up and speak. So, I would encourage you to take a look and see how some of those 2-minute comment periods run, so you can see you can get a feel for yourself. Would this actually work for us? Would that fit our community the way it fits in some of these other communities?
Is there a specific?
Or you can watch.
My most immediate frame of reference of 23 years would be Montgomery, which is a limit of 2 minutes. So that's something to think about. And I think, again, that would accomplish both interests, right?
Okay.
More time, but more speakers, something to think about.
You can watch the videotape committee hearings.
Correct, right,
Legislature
right.
there, 2 minutes.
Yeah, and I also would then offer that there is an opportunity. So many other districts have an advanced sign up. That does require a bit of administrative management. So that's just something to think about.
I'd like to speak to that. I think that implementing a user-friendly online form that's really advertised widely in a variety of, advertised on our website, working with Frederick News Post to advertise this online user-friendly form in different social media posts. I would like to see us move toward that instead of folks lining up outside the building. I'm worried about the implications for someone with a disability. And so if we are, moving towards this user-friendly online form, but then I was thinking potentially closing that form maybe 24 hours before the meeting, Tuesday at 6 p.m. Could we then utilize a random generator to determine speaking order? And then suddenly the 45 minutes, I mean, it still may be insufficient, but it's not prioritizing the person who is able to get online at 3:30 p.m., 3 hours before the meeting, but rather they've signed up and a random generator is what I would propose.
The nice thing about having an online form for sign up is it removes the impression that because I was the first person to sign up, that means I have to be the first person to speak. Because as the person submitting that says, I want to comment, I'm not going to know whether I'm the first, the last, or somewhere in between. Random generation of the order is an approach, and that's certainly something that the board could consider. But by having the online sign up with a statement as to, I want to talk about this item on the agenda, or I want to talk about this item that's not on the agenda, it does give us the room to, organize the agenda for the speakers however meets the interest of the board. So if the interest of the board is to have students first, the online form can have a space to identify as a student. Or if the board has an interest in having, the board agenda item prioritization, it gives us a lot of flexibility to do really however you want it to be organized for that to happen. I will say though, I agree with having a timed, this is when we stop accepting the online submissions. I would not take away the written sign up for those who may not have access to a computer, or you just can't get to it and decide that, oh, you know what, I didn't even know I could be there that day. So I would not take away that opportunity, and your ability to kind of fit that speaker in, whether in-person signups on the day of are default the last, or whether it's done with a Chromebook at the entrance, so they still get a digitized entry that that can be organized and consistent with the policy that we create. I would not take away that last minute sign up access.
And I guess, so your email was forwarded to
Oh, okay.
your email.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
so they've developed a online sign up.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit about that. I was trying to figure out whether I was going to forward it to you or not. So we could, without any policy changes, we could move to a digital sign. That doesn't require you to change anything about your policy. And what that would do is essentially have all the same information that people were writing down in a Google form. And so what would happen is we could set up, 3, 4, 5 Chromebooks at the back of the boardroom. And instead of people coming in and writing their information on a piece of paper, they just type it into this form. And what you would see you would all have access to that real-time response, which would allow you, if you want to apply prioritization, to do so. It's a simple sort on the sheet. It would also remove some of the difficulty sometimes reading people's handwriting and getting their names right and all of what they're there to talk about. We could institute that at the next board meeting without any policy changes, because it doesn't change anything but digitize what you're already doing. You may want to give the community notice that you're going to move to a digital, although it functionally isn't anything different than what you're doing on paper. But I think, to Mr. Blivis's point, the two main issues that you still have to really reconcile is the way in which you're going to apply order, prioritization, or random. Those are really your two options, or for 3 options, or first come, first serve. So those are the 3 approaches: first come, first serve, prioritization, or random order. You have to make a decision about that, and the approach to sign up. The districts using advanced sign up, Mr. Bass, have a particular day that it opens and a day that it closes. And I would argue the day it closes is a little bit further from adjacency to the board meeting date, because if I submit my interest in signing up, let's say a week ahead of time,
we want to give people 2 or 3 days notice whether they've actually been selected, because signing up doesn't promise you a spot. It just indicates your interest. And so if we were, I'm making this up, if we were to say the Wednesday prior to a board meeting, online signups open and they close Monday at 5, then we would have to apply whatever our selection criteria is on Monday evening. So Tuesday morning, they knew you have a slot, or for those who don't, but you did not get a slot for in-person, but we welcome you to submit a written comment at this address into the record. So we just might want to give people a little bit more advance notice if they have to physically be here or not.
And-
Just something to think about.
And to add to the complexity of the timing of things, right? Because that's really what we're talking about. At the same time that I 100% agree with what Dr. Sergo suggested, at the same time, if we're going to tie it to items that are in the board agenda, they have to have had an opportunity to see the board agenda before they submit, right? So we just
I'm
have
saying the Wednesday prior would
Right.
line that up. Yeah.
we just have to make sure we're cognizant of all of those kinds of timing issues as we're working through the logistics.
So my concern with the randomization is 2 things. I'm worried about the perception of transparency for the public.
Are they going to trust? Are they going to trust that they were
If it was really
randomly
random.
selected or
Yes.
not? Right.
So, maybe that's my only concern, I don't know. I do, so I am in favor of, us having some prioritization of order. I think I'm in favor of 45 to 60 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, and then that's it. No moving public comment to the end to allow for, so I really do, I think right now that I would recommend an approach at a certain number of speaker slots. Say 10 related to agenda items. Those be the first to speak, regardless of whether they're regardless of their affiliation. If it's agenda items, to me, we put them at the top, and then we still allow for some slots for non-agenda items, and maybe that's
Right. Yeah, I mean, if your public comments are going to be limited to, use your example, 6:15 to 7, you may not need to prioritize students because you're not asking anybody there to stick around until 11 at night, right? So you would need that level of prioritization. What I hear you saying is prioritize agenda topics for the first, what did you say, you were saying first half of the
First 10
slots?
people,
10
whatever.
Yeah, whatever
she's
we
just-
just, wherever we land in terms of
Okay.
time and or numbers, I think the first
Okay.
half
Right.
should be focused on.
So right now, under a 45-minute structure, you'd be talking, and 3 minutes per, you'd be talking 15 total speakers. The first 10 would be agenda, the remaining 5 would be not. If you changed it to 2 minutes, then you'd have maybe 11 to 12 that were agenda and 10 that were not. I mean, those are the kinds of, just puzzle pieces that can adjust.
I do like one thing you had talked about some of our neighboring counties, because I worry about Columbia. We say 45 minutes could be 15 people, but then we have 5 people that come here and claim to be speaking on behalf of an organization, where I like where they're doing 10 agenda commenters, and there's 5 reserved, specifically reserved for organizations.
Mhm.
That way, that would also, because I do believe that we need to vet. I think it's fair. I think it's fair to the public, the commenters, that we limit to 3 minutes, but you just don't come in and say, I'm with whatever, Green Trees.
Well, you could also reduce the amount
And
of
I
time
get
you
5
give to
minutes.
organizations. You could
So I-
say, we're going to give organizations committed slots, but they don't get any more time than an
Right.
individual.
Right. But I'm, and we can discuss that, but I do believe it's important that we vet them, that it's fair to the public, it's fair to everyone involved, that why did they get 5 minutes if they're not actually a licensed
Right.
business organization representing their organization? So I feel strongly about that. So just to get on the record, so my thoughts, I will say I'm being a little bit swayed, because I'm, much like Ms. Gallagher, originally, I had reservations about limiting public comment, limiting it at the beginning, but still giving people the opportunity. I'm starting to come around to that. being that my expectation is if we first introduced this, we would get explosive feedback responses. But I believe the public would adjust. I believe that they would understand, much like some do already, is you come and speak on behalf of that topic and maybe reference all the other people who are there in support of that topic. I mean, they might adjust
Right.
to this, especially if we made it clear our reasoning, why we're doing this, what supports legally we have to do this. Possibly, and I actually surveyed a number of districts across the nation at the national convention. And what's interesting is to a district, at least the ones I spoke to, they all offered alternatives to public comment for their constituents.
Electronic submission or
No,
something
they
different?
offered open forum meetings that were
Quarterly?
only for comment.
Mm.
Now, they did them in various different ways,
Mhm.
but they offered engagement forums where in this one district said any number of anywhere between 3 and 7 of our members commit to show up on that evening, and we open the floor up for the hot topics twice a year, once a quarter, whatever. They were varied. And they said that seemed to have really cooled the whole prospect of, well, you're limiting my rights to come and speak. And they said it actually improved their communication because in some cases that became more of a back and forth discussion about the hot issues that were on people's minds. And then their business sessions, their business working wasn't so tied down with,
Mhm.
you know, I've made the comment where sometimes public comment evolves into performance art. And, you know, they're more than entitled to come out, but when it just becomes a performance issue,
The message gets lost.
the message does get lost. So I like Mr. Bass's recommendation of 45 minutes, or if we differentiated that, I would, because I've kind of come around to, I don't necessarily say prioritize, but I wouldn't see any reason why we couldn't also say, okay, if agenda item 1.04 is public comment, 45 minutes. I don't know why we couldn't have 1.05 is student public comment for 15 minutes. I don't understand why we couldn't do that. We couldn't offer the same sign-up sheet. I think our students would love it if we gave them an online sign-up
Yeah,
or opportunity.
it'd all be the same.
Yeah, where they could go in and sign up during that 15-minute portion, because we honestly rarely get too much student comment, but we could allow them a portion of a specific portion of the agenda. We're not necessarily prioritizing them. We're just saying you get to speak at the beginning of the meeting like everybody else. But there's going to be a 15-minute period where we want to hear from our students.
You absolutely could do that.
And that's just my 2 cents to the conversation that I
45-minute public.
45-minute public
so total
comment, 15
60.
minutes, total of 60 minutes, and we're done. And then we work diligently to provide a forum for people to send in character limited or word limited public comment
Mhm.
to us that can become record
Right.
under public comment. My one question would be, if we have the online comment and you recommended that we still allow comment at the door, how does that work?
It would only be if slots are available,
Right,
Yeah.
which likely,
Right.
given our history, would be not likely.
right.
So,
So we need to make sure we communicate that to the public that we want to do, but
there'd be no walk-in
Right.
public comment.
then I do get back to your equity issue, that for those people that don't have access to a computer or the opportunity to sign up.
Well, they could call the board office. We could-
I mean, and you can reserve, 2 slots for public for walk-in. I mean,
Okay, that's,
you know,
see, that's what I was looking for.
You can do that too. I mean, you really do have a lot of flexibility. And when you're talking about separating out a 1.04 from 1.05, public comment, student comment, you're really talking about prioritization of comments and just a different way of doing it. Because we are prioritizing student comments and by saying we are reserving a period of time for student comments. And you could consider, like the neighboring jurisdiction that said, well, we will reserve slots for union representatives, but if not all slots are taken, they can be used for others. I mean, if we don't have 15 minutes worth of student comments, that could be an opportunity for those who walk in to fill in that gap time. And so we're still preserving that 60-minute period. I mean, again, just
Yeah,
so
and I
much
think
flexibility.
if you want to do a quarterly board forum, you know, and you want to memorialize that in policy, you could do that. And it doesn't have to be a full convening of the board. It could be sort of a quorum, if you will. We could certainly capture that. I would offer one thing as it then connects to your agenda. You may want to look at moving your action and consent items down after board business, right? To create sort of that streamlined experience. So you imagine the board meeting starts, it opens with comments, right? So that's essentially what it does. It opens with your student comments, your public comments, the superintendent, board comments, everyone sort of comments on the work of the day or whatever the issues are. And then you do the board business. You hear the presentations on the strategic plan or the updates on special ed. And then after you've sort of done that core work on teaching and learning and policy, you then do the action consent, which are not as, you know, they're not as, they don't require as much discussion. They require perhaps less cognitive stamina in some cases late at night. And so I think one of the things we've also heard the board say is like, gosh, I heard someone say, I wish I'd heard this before 9 p.m., right? That there was some presentations that went on and people, you know, it's tired, it's endurance. And so you may want to move your action consent items after board items so that it's sort of comments flow into the board business. And then after the not to diminish what happens in action consent, but it is a little bit more transactional. And that might be a more appropriate place to put it.
But then I think it makes it easier for management of the meeting to be aware of this is
Right.
our
And you've
business,
addressed-
this is
right.
action items, this is.
Right, and then you've addressed those other interests I heard you share, Mr. Blivis elevated around, you know, the staff, the principals, the teachers, the support professionals who are coming to do presentations aren't sitting through all the action consent items, which are important, but, you know, they've come to talk to you about special ed and they may, you know, they've sat through 30 minutes of a discussion about, you know, a facilities project or something. And so it'll make it a little bit smoother for your experience as a board member.
It's unclear to me, are you only speaking about action consent, which if it goes as expected should be 1 minute, or you're speaking about action items?
I hear what you're, right, so the current, in agenda, you know, this is a conversation for agenda setting, but currently most of the action and consent items are in facilities and operations. There are things around, you know, contracts, turf fields, many of them are operational in nature. There are, of course, are examples that are outside of that, but there's a, you know, it starts with our requisitions and purchasing, and it's a lot of them are, you said, they're things that arguably should be just boom, 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 boom. But you may want to put those items still in board meeting, of course, but after.
We're
I
getting,
think those are
I
a
think
work
they're-
session, but I think there's a proposal that I feel like I've heard a plurality of folks speak about. Maybe those could be, well, I should only speak for myself. I would support moving those business acquisition kind of,
We're piggybacking on a contract.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
as it relates to comments and where
Yeah.
comments.
There's been a talk among board members of moving those type of items onto consent agenda.
Oh,
yeah, so
So
we're,
that they don't even have to present. We're responsible for reading the materials. They don't have to be here to present.
Yeah.
so we're getting a little
So,
away
we're getting
from
away
the
from
public, from the focus
Ms.
on the
Gallagher
public
asked
comment
us to stay
section.
on topic.
And certainly there's room for us to revise the order of the agenda, but let's leave that discussion for, you know, another day. Two thoughts I want to just, you know, make sure I share. One, Mr. Rose, I think the public forum holding a quarterly town hall or whatever we want to call it is an excellent idea. I have seen it work in places I worked before where, you know, where that has really become a vehicle for leadership to receive feedback. I would suggest that in addition, we would consider, doesn't have to necessarily be in this room, you know, public forums like that, because they are not necessarily business agenda. You know, we're not conducting business there. So we could take it on the road, go to a high school, go to a library, go to another place that may be easier for people to gather, that may have, depending on the size, the number of people you expect, that may have a little more space. I mean, the certificate of occupancy for this room is robust, but we were packed to the gills last week. And so, we could take those forums out from just being here. The other thing I wanted to throw out there, and this is a more radical rethinking of things, because we have been focused on kind of living within this structure that public comments all come together. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the only structure that we consider. You could consider, and you may say, never, we hate this idea, and that's okay. You could consider, public comments that roll with the agenda. So agenda item 1.04 is I'll take a topic that everyone wants to talk about, the rebuilding of Brunswick High School. We will now receive public comments on the rebuilding of Brunswick High School. And anybody who wants to talk about that topic gets to talk about it before the board then has their discussion about it. And then you move to 1.05, implementation of a new discipline policy. And then public comments on implementation. That forces the focus of the public comments on the agenda items, right? It may be a little more difficult to administer. It means people can't just show up necessarily at 6:30, say what they want to say, and then leave, right? There are pluses and minuses of it. But I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't throw out there for consideration that the structure we've been living in and we're talking about is not necessarily the only structure.
We generally, or I think the policy as written, we are supposed to be hearing public comment before any action item. And I think nearly all the time, the president of the board does ask for it, but we don't frame public comment that way. We, as you say, we frame it as beginning of the meeting, and there could be an emphasis on topics specific before the board discusses and votes on a particular item. I think in general I support that, and it actually would clarify what we already have in our policy.
I like it. I like the idea too, and to piggyback on, it's actually not in policy where we allow speakers during action items. I believe that's more an interpretation of Robert's rules than it is policy. I don't see it in policy anywhere where we
It's not a
allow,
standard requirement.
but it's
not
an
all boards
interpretation
do
of
it.
Robert's rules
Correct.
that once you're taking action, you
Correct.
take a motion, get a second, we comment, then we allow board comment before, we allow public comment before we vote.
Can I give a quick clarification on in public comments, C in the second paragraph? It does say there is also an opportunity for public comment prior to the vote on any action item on the agenda, which shall be announced at each meeting.
There you go,
It is-
stand correct. Because that was a concern of mine when we talked about, because I'd always said I was one that I wanted to prioritize people who come here to speak on any agenda item, whether it's informational or. So I wanted to be able to differentiate people of giving, because we've always said you can speak during public comment, or you can choose to speak during the action portion of that agenda item. So that also threw a little quirk in how people sign up, and then giving them the option. And so I think that's why, whether it's informational or action, I like the idea of it's informational, because I always like prioritizing the opportunity for people who are here to speak on it, to address us on an item that's on our agenda to be given priority. I will like that. Then if there's time like that, that's why I liked, okay, let's give 5 people a chance to speak on anything they want. But I like the idea of, and then what limitation will we set on that?
Right.
That on each informational or action item, we allow 4 speak, whatever.
It adds a level of complexity. I don't know that it necessarily meets the interest of shortening or making the meeting a little more with more brevity, letting it finish earlier in the evening, because they do go late. So I don't know that it meets that interest, but it certainly would tie So if you go back to the board meeting we had this past week, the two or three of the comments that were made during the after we are done section were directly related to the special education presentation that really would have been nice to have heard those when the special education presentation was made, right?
Which relates to my previous comment.
Yeah, and I have made that comment clear that I believe you should be prioritized if you're here to speak on an agenda item, because I think it's important for us to hear those comments before we even have a discussion,
Which
whether
is the
we're voting or not.
application of these metrics you communicated to us would create that. You have 45 minutes and which is equivalent to 15 speakers at 3 minutes. You could say 10 of those 15 will be selected based on the topics that they've identified they want to talk about.
I think one of the best ideas we've had, these quarterly community listening sessions, I think are so important, and I'm glad you brought up that it can be throughout the community. It really can be maybe at high school auditoriums in each all of the 10 high schools actually, over a 2.5 or 3 year period.
And that is a structure I came from that experience. The board had a set schedule. It covered 3, and every year they selected 6 feeders to go and have an engagement with the community. And so there are other districts that are doing that, and it's highly, there's some niceties and there's refreshments and there's a way to sort of break bread together and engage and talk about the topics in a less formal setting. And because it's in the community, you're going to hear from that feeder about their feeder interests, right? So that's another way. It could be different than just going out. It could be, we're coming to the Ligonor feeder and we want to hear what this community, what their interests are for the board. So you could also sort of organize
To
it.
frame it for that. I mean, I somewhat ran on this in my campaign that I had even proposed taking board meetings on the road, one board meeting a year on the road. But I know that brings into all kinds of complexities with taping and all that. But when I spoke to example being the Catoctin feeder district, they were thrilled with any opportunity to afford them an opportunity not to have to drive all the way down from Emmitsburg and Thermont to offer something and the districts I spoke to at National Convention, perfect example, smaller school district, but huge geographic. It was like in Idaho or Montana, they were talking about hours. And they said, we do this in their case, twice a year, where we go to that feeder area and offer a forum that's extremely popular because
We could come up with a structure, Mr. Bass, for you to look at, because I think that's a really great idea.
I think that it's the only way. One, it's important and needed regardless, but it's the only way that any limit then on public comment is palatable, right? That we are creating additional structured, and I say structured, actually, I think the breaking bread and the spending time together is part of it as well. So there's a way in which it's maybe slightly less structured, but specific, that there wouldn't be board agenda items. It would be specific to hearing from the community, and in each feeder pattern over a maybe 2 or 2.5 year period. I think that's really important.
Where I've seen it done before, the leadership did do a presentation to start off just to share, hey, here's all the things we've been thinking about, here's the things we've been working on, here's the direction that we're going, and then allow, I mean,
if that's the model, then actually tonight's racial equity forum would be an example of how this could be done throughout the community. But I would think, I don't know, I would think on a variety of topics, and I almost think the biggest purpose is our listening rather than presenting. One item that's been brought up that I think I don't agree with at all, the verifying of organizations, I think creates a real creates a problem for us. I suppose there are standards we could follow, such as a registered 501c3, but I don't think that's the policy, the standard I would want to follow. I would much prefer to see us have 3 minutes of public comment across the board, whether you are an individual or an organization. I think just the nature of being different, I don't know, the nature of
Sounds like you want to acknowledge sort of the grassroots organizational structure also, like people who assigned an organizational title to their advocacy, or?
I worry
I
that
think it
I would
eliminates the need. I think
interpret.
it eliminates the need to differentiate, to say, I'm getting 5 minutes just because I made up a name.
Well,
It just
but
gives
I-
everyone the opportunity on equal footing to
yes,
provide public
Right.
comment.
but I don't want, whether it be me as a board member, or Sue Johnson as president of the board, or Catherine Rich as executive assistant to the board, I don't want any of us to be in a position to determine this is an organization and this is not an organization. It puts us in a terrible spot. 3 minutes across the board, I think, is what I would recommend.
Yeah, and Mr. Rez, I think your point is well taken. I think for us to implement a verification process of some kind, we would have to think very, very deeply about what that line is. Because you suggested 501c3. Well, what about a 501c6, which is an advocacy organization and not a nonprofit organization? Or what about someone who's not incorporated but has a business, right? I mean, there's so many, like trying to figure out where to draw that line. It wouldn't be impossible, but it would be challenging. And there are ways that you can do it, but the easiest solution may be the one you suggested, which is everyone gets 3 minutes. It doesn't matter whether you are an individual, the CEO of Microsoft, or the owner of a mom and pop grocery store.
Yes.
Because I mean, I've looked up some of the ones and they are not incorporated in any way, shape, or form within they have a Facebook page. They're not incorporated. They don't pay taxes, they have no filings, but we recognize them.
They organize themselves and they
Organize
feel they're an
themselves, we
organization,
recognize
right.
them. I would support that change, because also think it adds, because how would we, if they're pre-signing up, does that mean Ms.
Yeah.
Rich has to verify them
Yeah.
all prior? I mean, it adds another layer of work that has to be done to verify it. And again, I think it's one of those things where once we provide the information, they will adjust.
Yeah.
Everyone adjusts. I have my 3 minutes, I have my 7.
I have a couple more points, but I don't want to.
Me.
Oh. Thank you. Every so often, my walking to the meeting,
That's right. Go ahead.
a couple more points I just wanted to verify. I don't want to, I want to briefly again raise the random generation of speaker order combined with online sign up, I think could bring more speakers in. I think that I want to make sure we're hearing from the widest cross section of our community as we can. And I think that ensuring a really easy online sign-up sheet, but also that, maybe it's open from Thursday when the agenda is posted to, I would advocate to sometime on Tuesday, maybe it's Tuesday at noon, and then maybe, as an example, maybe 107 people have signed up for public comment, but we know we probably only have time for 15, and it's generated. And I do think that maybe more than 15, possibly get a number in case things go a little quicker. I don't know, either 1 through 15 or 1 through 20, but I think it would allow more folks who we don't usually hear from to speak. I think our current situation is we're only hearing from folks who can line up early, who can physically stand, and the way it's gone, and who can stay late.
And Mr. Ress, I think you're making a good argument as well for shortening the talking period from 3 minutes to 2. because again, you're adding the opportunity for more individuals to speak.
I don't support that at this time, especially if we're making the organizational change. My goodness, to go from 5 minutes to 2 minutes for the organization feels tough. I don't know, maybe it's just what I'm used to, but it feels like all the speakers, or because it's what they're planning for, I get it, it's a chicken or the egg, but folks are generally able to wrap up their thoughts in the 3 minutes. I'm more comfortable keeping to the 3 minutes.
I would just encourage you to watch some of the Montgomery County, and I'm sure there are others that limit it to, just so you can get the feel and see, you know, are you still hearing the robust public, you know, oral comments? Because again, you know, you couple the oral statement with a more detailed written statement, and that's still part of the public record. That's still something the board will be considering. I would just encourage you to just, you know, observe it so you can see how you think it would play in this community.
I had maybe one more thought. If we are, and I think we should, well, if we are prioritizing agenda item public comment before that agenda item, then I don't want specific time slots in the public comment period for agenda. I think then, I'm not explaining it well, but if we have 45 minutes for public comments, and then before 6.02 special education update, someone can speak to that, we don't need to prioritize agenda items within the 45 minutes of public comment.
So-
I would make it more open.
But most of those presentations are information discussion. And so, you know, the special ed presentation, a blueprint presentation, there's no action being taken. So the big presentations that we prepare for you, they wouldn't meet the criteria or the threshold for being open to public comment. So that would be the reason, just to be caught. You know, it would be like, you know, you're taking the action on the calendar, or you're taking action. So it's a little bit more discreet than the board presentation.
And I would submit, if you were to make the decision that you want to tie the public comment to the agenda item, whether you allow it for informational items as well or not, that you may end up at that point no longer having a public comment, a generic public comment section at the beginning, that any public comments unrelated to the agenda would then default have to be moved to the end. Because the idea is, the idea of doing that is we're trying to move through the business of the board, make sure the business of the board is conducted, and then we'll hear the unrelated items. So, and if I wasn't, I don't know that I was clear when I was articulating the concept, but in the way I was envisioning it is, you know, that public comment is no longer a part of the front. It is tied to the agenda with a section at the back end for unrelated comments.
I'm not sure I could support that. Go ahead.
Do we allot till 11:30?
Yes, usually.
Yeah.
This
is our
particular
limit.
meeting was allotted
Till
till
12:30.
12:30. I'm not saying we need to take all the time,
Yeah.
but we were allotted
We
to
were blocked at
12:30.
12:30.
I couldn't. So I think just following up to Mr. Bass's comments, I think my preference would be to keep the public comment at the start of the meeting, prioritizing the top, 10 related to agenda items, whether they're information, discussion, or action, that we still allow for that public comment during the action item only items prior to our vote. We have our
If
board
they haven't
discussion.
already spoken.
If they haven't already spoken.
Yes.
And that's it. No moving down to the end.
So the question then for the board is, there is a note in the public comment section that says, I thought there was something in here about at the will of the board, you can.
If more people wish to speak, then time
Thank you.
allows.
Yeah, public comment shall continue. I do think that one of the things that we hear, and I think this is to your point, Mr. Bass, is what that means. And more recently, there's been some dialogue during the board meetings about trying to flesh that out. And so you may want to if you might want to offer us some thoughts around this, because what I'm hearing today is, we're not going to say anyone who sticks around, we're going to hold you for the end. I'm hearing beginning,
and then associated with action. And so it may be your direction to us to remove that sentence and to say, we're not going to exercise discretion, because that's where that puts you all in a position to say, well, sometimes you let us and sometimes you don't, and all of those pieces. And that's maybe an area of friction that we've noted you've elevated.
This-
Remove it and
Yes.
say additional comments can be made at this form length.
Right,
Like,
written,
yes,
if there are
written.
more people who want to speak than time allows, we request written submission.
Yes.
And-
Versus
and as-
at the
and as
discretion
we
of the
discussed,
Yes.
this is the reason we propose adding the open forums.
Correct,
This is the whole reason we want to have that kind of engagement.
sure.
Because I did actually speak to Mr. Young about this.
Uh-huh.
And the spirit of this originally went to redistricting.
Oh, interesting.
That was the whole original spirit of it, was that redistricting is a very hot,
Right, very hot topic.
so the spirit of that was lots of people, lots of different parents with different thoughts on redistricting come in. So they added this in the spirit that gave them the opportunity to expand public comment.
Mhm.
Really, it was during redistricting, and
Right.
they didn't foresee some of the other things that it would evolve to.
Right, so then the message that removing this would send is, once we're done with public comment, we're not going to return to it at the end of the meeting if you've stuck around, but we welcome you to submit your comments in writing.
Because I don't think it's efficient anyway. It's like, one of the biggest complaints we got from the last meeting was that we were wearing people out. I mean, they all left. I mean, because that's what it evolves to, is 3 people stayed or whatever.
Right.
I mean, so I think we're in agreement that let's have it at the beginning. Let's make a reasonable amount of time, whether we decide, like I proposed 45, you proposed 45, and I said, well, let's have 15 minutes for students. And then that's it. But in that vein, in the spirit of hearing from our constituency, talking about introducing forums around our county that enables more people, then that enables more people. That's what I got from my people I spoke to
Sure.
from Idaho. And they said it actually reduced the amount of public comment because people took advantage of the forums. And they said one of the big things we did is they said they did them in schools, and they got down from the dais,
Mhm.
set up tables,
Mhm.
and they actually did they used speed dating.
Yep.
Where they allowed people to sit in front of a particular board member and have a conversation, and then beep, move.
Yep.
And they, I mean, there were a lot of creative ideas
Yeah.
in which they were trying to engage their community more, actually.
Sure.
And not make it so inefficient where they are here at 11 o'clock. Because some of those people that did stay till 11 o'clock had, like you said, they were there to speak on an agenda item, or they had a valid topic that we didn't give them an opportunity to speak on.
And I think one thing I would just punctuate that I think we might want to think about is sometimes I have noticed that there's almost an advantage to emailing the board because you all often are responsive and engage them. So one of the things I think we would have to agree to is that if you submit written comments, the board isn't going to respond to them in writing either, because that would be an unfair advantage. If you're saying that public comment is a one-way interaction, arguably, then that has to be applied to the written submission as well. And so I just think that's something to think about, because people are submitting public comment right now in writing, although it's not described that way, that's what they're doing. And you all are responding to them. And so if you're going to do that for people in writing, you should be doing it in person as well. So we
Well,
just have to.
That's where I brought up the topic of a fillable, just a fillable
Correct.
form.
So they don't
It's just a
email
fillable
you, they
form.
just, right. So we
It's a
want to make
fillable
sure that's
form.
clear.
Yes.
It goes to the board, but they're not inboxing.
And it's made public record, it made in the
Okay,
minutes.
got it. Just wanted
Yes.
to make sure that was clear.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for that.
But I think to about the public forums, we've had some missteps in our communication with particular communities too, when there are big decisions that we might have. Redistricting is one of them. Middletown Elementary, middle
CIP.
school, CIP. I mean, I think that that we also still need to be engaged around those particular topics too, and that we're communicating and getting that input. And so it might be outside of, and we do this,
Yeah, of course.
when there's
Yeah, of
redistricting,
course.
we're going to communities and we're hearing, and there's opportunities that they don't have to wait to come to
Absolutely.
When it's actually on the agenda, we should be continuing to be proactive in our communication when these items, when you know these items. are
Understood,
happening
yeah.
Outside of the public forum structure.
One of the scenarios where I think this went very well was with Sibyllsville. A year or two ago.
It went well eventually. It did not go well initially.
Well, I can only speak to
Initially,
what I was
right.
involved with.
Yes.
That Ms. Johnson, Ms. Barrett and I went to Sibyllsville Elementary, and just the conversation together with the community was, I think, well received on all sides, and just it was just very important. And there was a lot of mutual respect. I learned a lot. Yeah, I think these community forums can really rebuild trust. I think we would learn more. It would bring us, I think we would end up interacting with some parents, teachers, students who may not be attending our meetings here. Yes, as we are considering changes to public comment, would it be, Dr. Sergo, I think you said this, but would it be appropriate for you to put together a tentative schedule for us to consider for some of these public community forums, so that we are considering the full scope of, if there's some limitation on a board meeting night, how are we opening ourselves up to more public comment in other ways?
Yeah, so we have 10 theaters, and what we've done is Dr. Dyson and I meet with theater leaders. We sort of set up a schedule to do that. So we would sort of take a similar approach. And so to use your example, let's say the board decides we're going to do 4 a year. It would take you about 2.5 years to get through all feeders. And so feeders would know once every 2.5 years, they are the host site for a board engagement. It wouldn't be called a board meeting, it would be a board engagement. And we could set up a template or a structure. I would want to work with Dr. Alavito and the school team around what that could look like, have an opportunity for our leaders to talk about that, but also our parent leaders. And so Dr. Dyson and I also meet regularly with Tracy Tatum. And so we want to get sort of, we don't want to make, we always want to strike that fine line. This isn't, it's a joint effort between our families, our board, and our system. And so how do we create a meeting experience that doesn't make it any one person's platform, right? So it allows that to sort of be the spirit of what it is you're after to occur. So I'm happy to talk with those individuals and bring something back to the board. It'd be outside of policy committee, arguably, but I could bring that back to the board.
Yeah, I think we should add that.
Okay.
That's something that we might put in a work session for the whole board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you could, because I think it's important also that you talk with the staff that's going to be the support
Exactly.
to an event like this. We're going to ask staff to come out with us from 6 to 9 or something 4 times a year. I think it's important we involve their input in that regard.
And Mr. Bass, you used the phrase community listening sessions, and I put that in quotes because I love that phrase. Because that's really the intention. It's an opportunity for the board to listen to the community. I
Yes.
really like that phrase.
Thank you. I think, and we should play with frequency just a little bit. Quarterly sounds very appropriate for me as I think about the 7 of us. To only be in one feeder pattern every 2.5 years doesn't sound frequent enough. And so I think we should also play with whether this could be an every other month thing, 6 a year, to increase how often we're in different feeder patterns. And or, though I don't like the second suggestion as much, if we split ourselves up and it's only 3 or 4 of us, depending whether we want quorum or not, we could do this more frequently.
That was what this district out west was doing, was that there was no requirement. It varied from 3 to 7. Sometimes everyone attended, sometimes they didn't.
Yeah, I wouldn't think of it in context of quorum because that suggests a vote on a business action item. But I do think that you do need to have a minimum number of individuals from the board to hear, because, I mean, honestly, what are the optics going to be if Mr. Bass, you're the only one to show up? Not that you're not a great listener, but people are going to be thinking, well, where is everybody else? Why is it just one board member that's listening
Yeah,
to me?
they did require that they had a minimum of 3. They required there was a minimum of 3, but he said, sometimes we have 7. It just varies. Because I think if you would talk about that, if you're trying to schedule 6 in addition to however many board meetings we have and committee meetings, it is difficult to expect to have all 7 board members at all 6. I mean, I just don't want to set that precedent, that expectation. I much prefer to under-promise and over-deliver. I don't want to set that expectation.
Especially when you factor in the summertime, and the travel and vacation.
And how much how beneficial would it be to have a listening session in Brunswick in July?
Right.
Right. Might not even be anybody there. We might have one every 2 months during the school year.
Right.
It just depends.
There was one item that we discussed that I don't think we got that much clarity on. Would we have a specific section for student public comment? And I don't know if you need further direction from us right now on that.
So I mean, that was the suggestion that Mr. Rose had made, that we have a dedicated 45 minutes for public comment, a dedicated 15 minutes for student comment. So that would expand the total time from 30 to 60 minutes. Mr. Best, you had suggested 45 to 60 minutes. Mr. Rose, you're obviously supportive of 60 if you're making that presentation. Ms. Gallagher, you had said 45 minutes. I don't know that we necessarily heard from you about whether 60 is too much or whether you like the idea of incorporating the dedicated time for the student with any unused student time can be devoted to other individuals who want to give comment.
Do you want to go first? It doesn't matter.
You go first.
I'm in favor of 60 minutes. I'm okay with 45 minutes. And I would support the separate agenda item for student comments or putting them as 5 of our 20 slots in it's either way. I'm okay. Either way.
My strong preference remains the random generation of order of the commenters, and then students would have equal access to non-students to speak. That's my top preference. If we don't do the random generation, then I think allocating 15 minutes specific to students as an agenda item, I like that. I think it's an interesting item. I'd be interested legally and also philosophically. Do students then not have any opportunity to speak in the general public comment? And is that legal to tell a student, no, that's not your time. You can speak just a little bit later.
Yeah, I'd want to do a little more research into it. My initial reaction is that because this is a limited public forum, you do have the ability to impose those kinds of restrictions, as long as, Mr. Rose suggested earlier, you're not making the decision on whether you can or cannot speak based on, a position on a topic. I wouldn't say necessarily on a topic, because we can say you can only speak on the agenda items, but not a position on a topic.
Gotcha.
That's my initial reaction, Mr. Bass, but I would welcome the opportunity just to spend a little more time digging into whether there's been any thought given to that.
And just hearing Mr. Tessarello speak recently, I think about the impact it would have on our students that we could publicize it. We care, and we are placing an opportunity for them on our agenda to be heard. I think that's important that they know we're hearing them too, because there's been a lot of, oh, they don't pay taxes. Well, yeah, some of them do. Many of our high schoolers work and pay taxes like everyone else. Yes, they don't vote, but they did, as he pointed out, they voted for our representative at twice the level that they voted for us.
Well,
So they are engaged. I mean, there are a number of our students who are engaged in that particular choice of their representative. And I think it's important to show that, I always look at it like they are our customers.
Well, and
They are our clients.
we're funded on a per pupil allocation, and so certainly even our funding structure is at the level of the student. So I would argue that they certainly have an important perspective. I just want to clarify something that you said though, Mr. Bass. We're talking about random generation within the prioritization structure you've offered, because what I heard you say was 10 for agenda-related items, 5 potentially for organizations or us. We need to go back and get.
Well, now,
So
now
now you're
we're talking
saying-
about eliminating the organization, so it would actually be 10 agenda.
And 5
5
on any
open.
topic. So there's a prioritization that's being applied, but within that prioritization,
two
that you're talking about
realms.
recommendation for random selection.
I think there's great validity in what I think both Ms. Gallagher and Mr. Rose have proposed on that.
Yeah.
My preference would actually be to not differentiate agenda item and non-agenda item, but simply we have a period of time, probably the Thursday to the Tuesday, where people can sign up for public comment. They get 3 minutes, it's randomly generated. If we were to adopt the prioritizing 10 slots for agenda, 5 slots for non-agenda items, then yes, the random generation would need to happen, I guess.
Inside of that, categorically.
Yeah.
Right, so when someone was to sign up for public comment, they would indicate what they're there to talk about.
Right.
And
Which was on
indicating-
the thing you
Correct,
sent
I'm,
us.
Indicating I'm here to talk about an agenda topic or other. And if I'm here to talk about other, then I'll be bucketed with this other group, and there'll be 5 people selected from that group, or 10 people selected from the agenda group.
I think that could work as long as legally, you've said it's limited public forum, so you think we're on an okay spot legally. What I want to avoid, I hope Ms. Johnson would be happy with this, and I think she would be. What I would want to avoid is that the chair not have to, oh no, this person signed up to speak on this agenda item and their public comment is going slightly off.
Yeah.
I don't want the chair to have to determine that in the moment. I don't know that helps anybody.
And at some point, I do have to rely upon the honesty and the integrity of the people as they sign up. I have to count on that. I also would like to add a perspective that if we don't have, say we do that, and we only have 7 people that sign up to speak on an agenda item, would we make it our policy that then we're still going to hear from 15? Does that make sense?
If we have a total of 7 people sign up.
Say we allocate 10 spots for agenda item comment, but only 7 even put their name in. So
Yeah.
we would move those other 3
Yes.
so that we always do adhere to
Yes.
hearing from 15.
I think, yes, it's the application of that union slot that I was describing earlier. So yes, if we didn't have 10 people who signed up with specific agenda item subjects, but we still had more than 15 total individuals interested, yes, those other 3 slots would roll into
Then
the
roll into
that
open
other
public
bucket,
comment.
into the open bucket. Yes, absolutely.
And then I think we need to talk about the idea that you had, do we reserve 2 slots for people to show up at the door?
It's tough in the sense that 2 slots is almost, or is sort of not enough. It's tough in the sense that I want equity of access. To me, it came up recently that someone had a physical disability and was, just unable to stand on the line. And so I think my priority, my preference is a very user-friendly online form, but that also lists, or you can call the FCPS main office to give a few options, but to go away from relying on people to stand online, which prioritizes people without a physical disability.
I just want to make sure we're making it as accessible as possible.
And so the other piece of follow-up I would ask, if we are moving in the direction of a defined period with no tack on at the end, do we want to incorporate into the randomization of it? And this makes, there's nothing truly random about this at that point, but, Dr. Sergo's suggestion that, we prioritize those who've not spoken at the session prior. So we're not hearing from the same person because they happen to get, randomly selected 3 times in a row. Is that something that you're interested in? I mean, obviously,